Good morning and welcome to our webinar on leadership, building an effective project team. Let me tell you a little bit about CoreTech Revolution. We have been in business for over 15 years and started as a small website development organization to become a leading healthcare IT consulting firm. We have clients throughout the country, and we work with healthcare and technology companies of all sizes. We do everything from strategic planning, organizational change, project process development, digital medicine, workflow optimization, and anything that has to do with HIPAA regulations. The company was started by Michelle Burton. Michelle is the principal owner of CoreTech Revolution. She has over 20 years of healthcare technology experience, and she's an expert in program and project management. She also knows strategies in health information exchanges and EMR deployments and has worked extensively in both those areas. Michelle also has worked with companies of all sizes and across the entire country, focusing on delivering results. Michelle will be leading our webinar today. My name is Jane Niederberger, and I have over 30 years experience in companies of all sizes also, primarily in healthcare and technology. I've held several senior exec positions, and in the most recent years, I've been working with CoreTech as a partner in our strategy solutions. So let's talk about a little bit of today's webinar. You will see that we are recording this whole webinar, and both the recording and the slide deck will be emailed to you. Submit your questions at any time. We'll do a Q&A at the end, so please, if anything is on top of your mind, just jot it down. And then please complete the survey that we will email to you after today's session. That helps us do a better job as we move forward in future webinars. So today's webinar is the third one in our series on project management. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Michelle Burton.
Good morning, and thank you, Jane. I'm so glad you could all be with us today to go over this webinar on how to build a project team. I know that can be very challenging from a leadership perspective, and so Jane and I have a lot of great information to share with you today. What we're going to be focusing on in general is what your project structure should be, a project management methodology and which one you should choose, which is right for your organization, how to find the right people to build that project team, and whether or not you should use in-house resources or consultants or some combination of both. And it's going to be a lot of information that we're going to share with you today. And some of it may be overwhelming because it's a very complicated topic at times. But what we're going to do today is a little different. We're going to take you through the process that we would take one of our typical clients through in order to come to these decisions. So instead of just sharing with you a whole bunch of information, we're going to take you through the real world process that we would take our clients through. And obviously, we can't take you through every piece of it because this is something when we take our clients through this process, it would take significantly longer than an hour to do. But we're going to give you a pretty good taste for it, and try not to be overwhelmed. And just remember, I put this little encouraging quote here for all of us. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. So today is just the first step in a very long journey in order to build the right project team. So the first thing that we would do for one of our clients is level the playing field. So what we have learned over the years is that we have seen so many clients struggle, and I'm talking really struggle with the simplest of things, which is just definitions, right? One person's interpretation of a particular word or process might be completely different than another person's interpretation of that same thing. So what we typically do when we go into a client site is just really start from the very beginning And in order to do that effectively, we grab the key decision makers that are going to be responsible for the project, and we level the playing field. And to do that, what we do is just start with some basic definitions and make sure that we're all agreeing that these are the items that we're trying to cover. So since today's topic is about building a project team, the definitions that we would start with a client team is really just what is an organizational structure and what is a project methodology, and define those things. So then as we go through the next steps, which is to ask a series of questions to figure out, where we want to be, everybody's working from the same definitions and the same handbook, so to speak. So what we're going to start with right now is organizational structure. So what is an organizational structure or for a project? And so this is not your organizational structure as a whole across the organization. It's really just what is your project organizational structure. And there are two basic kinds of organizational structures. There is a project-based organizational structure and a matrix-based organizational structure. And so the first is project-based. And a project-based organizational structure is really just what this picture illustrates. It's where the resources inside of a project report directly up to the project manager, and then the project manager reports to the director. This is great for some specific projects if you have very specific, or if your organization is completely project-based, but it does come with some challenges for long-term organizational structure and project-related issues. And Jane, I think you have an example that you wanted to share here about a project-based structure.
I do. I was brought into a company as an employee to lead a major systems implementation. And the systems implementation was a 2 to 3 year project. So it was a significant length of time. And we used the project-based methodology, or organizational structure, excuse me. And the reason why we did that is because it was a 2 to 3 year project. It was not for a couple months or for a couple weeks. It was long enough term. And we needed to make sure that we got the work done well, and the work done on time. And therefore, by aligning people directly to the project manager and having that project manager accountable for performance reviews, providing feedback, hiring and firing, if you will, development, it meant that there was absolutely no confusion on the team members' part about who they were accountable for, who helped them with prioritizing their work, who provided clarities on timeline, resources, and anything else they needed to get the work done. So it was very clear. I am here to do this system implementation. I report up through Mary, and that is what our job is, and Mary dictates what I do. Some of the challenges that come at the end of a project like that, and sometimes during, is it doesn't always integrate into the ongoing operations of a company. The project team doesn't. They have to work at that. So they have to take the time to communicate with the managers who are running the day-to-day business. Here's what we're doing. Here's how it's going to impact you. Here's why you should care. Because the project team is somewhat set aside from the day-to-day operations. So there's an awareness that needs to be made of what is happening. The other thing that needs to be taken account, and this is usually at the beginning of setting up a project team in this form, is what happens to people when the project's all done. Do they go away, if you will, as in exit the company or need to search for a new job? Or do they integrate back into another org structure where they're doing either the project maintenance on an ongoing basis? So it's a conversation that needs to be had. And if you do it up front, people are good with that. They're looking at it. If it comes as a surprise at the end, it's a little bit more of a challenge. Michelle?
So the next one that we're going to go through is just the matrix-based organization. So this is a little different in that each team works for their own functional area. This is, I think, what we more typically see. You've got, your development team, your project PMO team, your business teams, all the different teams across your organization, and you pick the resources from inside each of those teams that you're going to assign to this specific project. So those team members still report up to their functional managers. So development resources would still report up through, the CIO, but they also have a dotted line to the project manager in this case. So the project manager is responsible for their day-to-day work with regards to the project, but their actual manager is still assigning them other tasks. They may be assigned to more than one project. And just across the board, this is more commonly seen inside organizations, this particular type of structure. Now, one of the challenges here is that sometimes the project manager doesn't always have enough authority, and so they struggle with getting resources that report up to these different managers to complete the work inside the project in the timeframes that they have, because they're pulling at these resources from other tasks or other things that might be assigned to them. And so the project manager is really struggling with the different goals that these particular resources have. Their goal, unlike the project organizational structure, the goal of these team members might be not just the goal of the project, but it might be the goal of multiple projects or specific goals inside of a development team or different things like that. And so those other outside factors can have an impact on the project, and based on the level of authority that the project manager has, it can have project impacts. And Jane, I think you also have a really great example for matrix organizational structure.
Sure. Matrix organizational structure was very big for the Y2K conversion and the HIPAA, meaning HIPAA regulations later on. But let's talk about Y2K and why that worked and didn't work. Oftentimes you needed a strong project team or PMO to make sure that the various pieces and parts of Y2K were being done. But the project managers were very dependent upon the functional areas and what was in their systems, in their processes, and how to make that work, to make the conversion over to the year 2000 be as seamless as they could. And Matrix worked well. The company I was with, Matrix management worked really well because there was strong leadership from the top. And by the top, I don't only mean a program director, I mean the CEO, the COO of the company, the chief information officer. They were all totally aligned on what needed to be done. And there was a real deadline involved that wasn't going to move just because somebody wanted it to or we were running out of time. The nice part was staff were still tied to their home department. So as Michelle said, they still could see the functions of day-to-day and be involved in their daily work, yet they also had deadlines and timelines driven by the Y2K team. So the work felt very relevant to their daily tasks. If they didn't get the Y2K work done, they may not have a job on January 1st, 2000. We all know that didn't happen, that the work all happened well across a variety of businesses. The other nice part is in a functional role, there's no missteps in terms of HR transactions, performance reviews, promotions. You're not losing your status, your hierarchy, the relationship that you built with your manager. So that all stays intact while you're getting the work done. The downside of that can be if you do not have strong project managers who can stay on top of the work and stay on top of people all over the organization, you could get in trouble. But strong project managers are very good at coordinating and talking to the different functional areas and making sure that people are aligned. Timelines are sometimes challenged in this model. The functional manager may feel that his or her work takes higher priority. If there is a system outage, they will always pull that as, you need to stop your project work, I need your help over here. Depending upon the stability of an organization's systems, that can really railroad a project. So that needs to be looked at, and what is the true prioritization and how do you set that up? It also can result in resource disputes. If a project manager doesn't feel like they have enough people. So in Y2K, mostly everything was ticking along. The COBOL programming was the hot skill to have when we were doing that. And the company I was with still had several old systems that needed COBOL programming to run the day-to-day business. And so we were fighting over who gets these people, who gets the talent. The more talented individual we could get on the Y2K team, the faster and more reliably we could get the work done. But the functional manager who's being evaluated on performance and uptime wants that same person on her team. So there are those kinds of conversations and push and pull situations that are always happening. But if you have a strong project manager, and if you have strong business sponsors, business execs, this is a very good org structure. And this is, as Michelle said, how most companies operate.
So once you decide on your project structure, once you understand the definition of a project structure, then we have to understand the definition of a project methodology. So the two key buzzwords that you often hear inside project management when it comes to methodology are Waterfall and Agile. So I'll just quickly define both of them for you. Waterfall is a structure that is often used in tandem, just like a waterfall, right? Step 1, step 2, step 3, everything happens in order until you get to the very end of the project and you have all of the project complete. It tends to be a lot more rigid than an agile project, which is very flexible. In an agile project, it allows you to make changes throughout the project. If the project were to change or requirements for the project were to change, you can easily adapt to that. The project does not have a specific start and a specific end date. What it instead has is what they call sprints inside Agile terminology. And so inside each sprint, you define what the work is that's going to happen in that time period. Typically, a sprint is somewhere between 2 weeks or a month. What's going to happen inside that sprint? Everyone agrees to that work, and then that work is completed, and at the end of the month, those tasks can all be checked off. And then the reason it allows flexibility is because if something changes while one sprint's going on, you can easily modify that for the next sprint to bring those deliverables into the next piece of work. So it allows a great deal of flexibility with regards to your project work, whereas Waterfall is more rigid with a specific end and specific beginning and end date. I will say that there can be some challenges if you roll out Agile in one area of the organization, but not across the board. A great example I have is I worked with a client who within a matrix organizational structure, but they only rolled out Agile inside their development team. So you had a project manager who reported up to a PMO who had resources that were coming from all across the organization, business resources, product managers, and development resources. But the development resources were tied to an Agile methodology with a project manager inside their team, whereas the project as a whole was tied to a Waterfall methodology. And so the project manager struggled to fit the Agile task inside the overall Waterfall project plan, and it did become a challenge. So if you're deciding on Waterfall or Agile, you need to not just look at what your specific team might need, but how it's going to impact the organization as a whole, especially if you're using a matrixed organizational structure. So if you roll out the development team as an agile process, but the rest of the organization is working on waterfall, that might be problematic. Or if you're rolling out a waterfall methodology and the rest of your organization is working on agile, again, that might be problematic. So it really depends on, are you making the decision as an organization as a whole, or are you just making a decision for your team specifically? And so you can just quickly see right here the differences between waterfall and agile. I have found that ultimately what works best is when you incorporate the best of both worlds. So a lot of clients I have worked with, again, don't have true waterfall and they don't have true agile. They have a combination that they've kind of modified around and made work for their team or their organization based on their project needs. And that is often what becomes the most successful. But you can see right on here, waterfall is sequential. It requires defined requirements. It delivers quality products, as does agile. And it's a very rigid process, whereas agile is much more flexible. It accommodates change. It also delivers quality products. I'm not sure why that box isn't checked there, but it does. And it is constantly evolving. And that's really just the difference between those two product or project methodologies. So we've level set the definitions at this point. The next thing that we would take one of our clients through is just a series of questions to evaluate what is your specific organizational needs. So we've all agreed we know what a project structure is, we know what those definitions are, and we've all agreed that we know what a project methodology is and what those definitions are at a high level. So now how, as an organization, do you determine, do you belong to, which organizational structure do you belong to for projects, and with which methodology do you belong to for projects? And so this is where we would help our clients answer a series of questions. And in order to do this, before we talked about making sure the key decision makers understood the definitions, right? Now we're going to broaden our scope. We're not just talking to those key decision makers anymore, right? Because those key decision makers have an idea in their head of what the optimal world is. But what we need to figure out in order to help people understand what's going to work best for them and guide them in the right direction is what's actually happening inside your organization today. So we want to talk to folks that aren't just key decision makers. We want to talk to some of the people who are actually doing the work. And these are just a handful of the questions we would ask. This obviously is not all encompassing. But, you know, we're going to ask questions like, are you typically working on repeatable projects? Are your projects more unique in nature? So what those two questions try to get to the bottom of is, you know, a repeatable project is onboarding someone. If you're onboarding, like you have a software product and you have to onboard new organizations to your software product or roll out that product to their organization, you know, that would be more considered a repeatable project, versus a unique project is more software development, or you need to replace your whole network. That's obviously not something you're going to do over and over again over months. You're going to do that one time and then hopefully not have to do that again for a very long time. So that's kind of the heart of where we're trying to get to with those questions. Are your project deliverables concretely defined? So do you have a product management team? Are those people providing requirements to your project team? Or is the project team sort of flying more blindly, or is the project manager also expected to be your business analyst who might be helping to define requirements? Who leads your projects today? So even if you don't have a project organization, you still have somebody who's leading your projects, you know, even if it's in an unofficial capacity. So who's doing that work? Who's pushing work forward? Who's doing that? Is it your managers? Are your developers guiding themselves? Where is that work being directed from and pushed from, and who's leading those projects today to keep things moving forward? And really, this last question is very important as well. What successes are you currently experiencing? Because you are experiencing successes. And if there are things that are working, when we're looking at what project structure and methodology works best for your team, we want to know what those successes are across the organization, because we want to make sure whatever's making those things successful, So we're incorporating those pieces into the project. And I mentioned this before on the last slide, but one great example I have, as a consultant for a very long time, one of the questions I am asked continually before I go into a client engagement, before they decide whether or not they want to hire me, one of the first questions I'm always asked is, what project management process do you use? What methodology are you most familiar with? If they're looking for Waterfall, do you use Waterfall, or are you very strict with that process, or are you familiar with Agile? They want to know, do I have that particular skill set? And my answer is always the same. My answer is always the same. I said, I have yet to work for an organization or company that follows a true process when it comes to project management. And by true process, I mean, to the letter, what comes out of the PMBOK that a project manager has to be certified for. I have yet to walk into an organization that uses that process. What I typically walk into is organizations that use some combination of the processes, as I mentioned on the previous slide. And so they've pieced together what works best for them. And when I come in, I'm not trying to stop people from doing what works, right? I'm trying to help them take what works and do it better. So again, I'm not trying to, you shouldn't be trying to ram a particular process or methodology down someone's throat or down your team's throat. You should be looking at all of these questions and then trying to figure out what makes the most sense for your organization. And it might not be a true project process. Every team, every organization works differently, and you have to find the methodology and organizational structure that works best for you in order to be successful. So I know, again, these are just some of the questions that we ask people. There's a lot of information that I haven't shared here when we're going to interview your team to figure out what organizational or structure methodology work best for you. There's a lot more questions that we would go through. And so if you want to know more about what those questions might be, feel free to put a question in the chat window specific to what you think might be relevant for your team, or feel free to stick around after the presentation and we can kind of chat with you. Or, you can also at any point just schedule some time with Jane or I directly and we can kind of go through that. The next set of questions that we're going to ask are specific to making sure you find the right resources for your team. So we've talked about the organizational structure and the methodology, but now how do you find the right resources to support that project team and become successful? And some of the key questions that you want to ask yourself here, and again, this is not a complete list, is do you have a job description for meeting the tasks that are needed for this project? That's a basic where everyone wants to start, a job description. And your job description is going to be based very much on the answers to the questions we were asking in the last slide. And do you have any specific project and or deliverable needs? Like Jane mentioned in her example, is there a specific coding experience that you need? Is there a project manager with a specific level of communication do you need? Do you need a project manager who's familiar with conversations at an executive level? Or is your project manager just going to be managing timelines and people at a lower level and reporting up to a manager who then will talk to executives? These are the kinds of questions you want to ask yourself before you bring in a resource. Are there any specific, industry buzzwords that you want your project manager to be familiar with, right? So everybody's different, right? If you work in the automation industry, those buzzwords are going to be very different than if you work in the healthcare industry. And you're going to want to make sure you bring in a resource who's familiar with your industry. A good project manager can work across any industry, but that doesn't mean that there's not value to bringing someone in who's already familiar with the buzzwords specific for your team. This one's my favorite. Do you need a like-minded team member, or do you need someone who's outside of the box, an outside of the box thinker? And the reason that this one's my favorite is because so often with clients, I see them bring in someone who thinks just like their management team, who thinks just like their development team, like they all have a similar value set. And so what happens if that value set is a group of soft-spoken people, or even the opposite, right? A group of people who are very outspoken, you either find yourself getting into a lot of arguments, or you find yourself never moving forward with things. And so do you truly want someone who's like the rest of your team, or do you want someone who's different? So in the example where you have a bunch of soft-spoken folks, do you need someone who is a slightly more assertive personality type to come in and drive things forward to hit specific project deadlines? Or, you know, if you have a bunch of people who are more strong-willed, do you need someone who can come in and be more calming and kind of get everybody working together as a team and moving forward? These are things that are very important to think about as you're going forward. And then the last one is, don't forget to use your current team members, right? The people who you already have inside the organization who are going to be working with this new project team or project manager, they're very valuable. And so you should use them in the interview process in whatever capacity you feel makes the most sense to help you make sure you're finding someone who's the right blend for your team and organization as a whole. And so you have to make sure that you're looking at this whole big picture in order to move things forward successfully. And I have an example that I wanted to share with you with regards to this. We worked with a team, Jane and I worked with a team, I don't know, it's probably about 3 years ago, that they had brought us in to do one thing. They wanted us to help them consolidate their entire organization IT department. And after we took them through this process and asking them a series of questions, we realized that that's not at all what they actually needed. They needed a completely different path to go down, and consolidation was actually going to make the problem they were having much worse. And so we suggested a different path forward for them. We took them through this exact process that we're walking you through right now to build their team and improve their structure. We gave them some suggestions and passed off a document for them. And they have continued to implement that. We've stayed in contact with them over the years, and they've continued to implement that and see a great deal of success. So I just can't stress enough that it's just incredibly important that whether, you know, you're working with outside resources to help you take you through this process, or internally, that you're still going through this process and making sure that you're asking the right questions across your organization. You don't just want to hire a project manager and be like, that solves all our problems, because it likely won't. You know, you have to have some direction and structure around that, and you want to make sure you're asking the right people the right questions in order to develop the right processes. So last but not least is the age-old question: should you bring in a consultant, or should you work with in-house resources? And there are a lot of things to consider when you're trying to make this decision, you know, resource capacity, timing for the project, budget, risks associated with the project and how much risk you can absorb. And it can be very difficult and overwhelming to know what the right process is. So one of the things that we look at as we're helping people decide what the right path forward is, because, you know, we help people go through this process, but it's not like they're using us to implement it. As I gave in that last example, that was implemented 100% in-house. What we look at, though, is what do you have? What are your processes? Again, are you doing a repeatable implementation? And if so, in-house resources are great for that, because you already know what your process is. You just need somebody to manage it, right? So let's document that existing process and then bring somebody in who can just manage it, and we can build from there. Versus if you have something that's different or unique, then it gets a little bit more challenging. Budget can also be a huge factor, but I would caution you to not make decisions based on budget alone, because if you're looking strictly at budget alone and you bring someone in who is you hire an in-house project management resource, but they don't end up having the skill set that you need, what you can often do is create an environment of dysfunction. And so across the organization, they're going to be like, oh, Mary Beth hired this new project manager, but she's not actually getting anything done. And project management is not going to be successful for our organization. And that was just a complete failure and waste of time and waste of money. So make sure, again, you're looking at the organization as a whole, as opposed to just budget, although budget is an important factor to consider. And what we would recommend is, if you're starting from ground zero, right? You have no methodology, you have no project structure, you have no project team. In that scenario, that's where you would want to potentially look at bringing a consultant on board. Because that consultant is going to be able to provide you with a level of experience, especially if you bring in a high-level senior consultant. They're going to be able to provide you with a level of experience that can help you organize those tasks, help you determine what your project structure and methodology are, help guide the way, help create processes. And then from there, they can help you hire the right resources that you would need in order to support your project team. They can help you train those resources and just create an overall well-oiled project management group that's just going to knock it out of the park. It takes a little longer to do that, but over the long run, you're probably going to save yourself a lot of time, frustration, and it's going to be much more cost-effective for your budget than if you had gone the other way and tried to bring in an in-house resource to do those things. So you just have to find the right consultant, because if you do find the right consultant, the transition will be so seamless. When they exit the company as a consultant, you're not even going to know that they're gone. And I can tell you, I recently worked with a client out of California who did not have a project team. And I went in there, I helped them to build their project team and some of their processes. We rolled out an Agile project methodology. They got to a place where they were ready to hire an in-house project manager. I took everything that I had created for them and I trained that in-house project manager. And then I left. And the new project manager was so nervous when I left. He's like, please don't go. I'm going to be lost without you. I told him, I'm not going to be working for the organization every day anymore, but I'm not going anywhere. So, his name was Jason. So Jason, if you have any problems, just give me a call, right? Just call me up. I'm going to answer your questions. I said, don't call me 50 times a day, but feel free to call me and ask me whatever questions you have. And I'm going to be here to help you. I'm not going anywhere. And I can tell you that he has not called me, not one single time. Now, I have checked in on him several times, and I've checked in with some of the other team members to make sure that he's not struggling, but he's doing great. And I did my job well, because as much as I hate to say it, they don't notice that I'm gone. I want to be, and that's really where you want to be. You want to be so valuable that when you exit, people don't notice that you're gone, because you've done such a great job of setting them up. And that's where you want your project team to be, right? You want them to be such a well-oiled machine that things are just clicking, and that's how you want it to go. So Jane, I think you have an example that talks about both the pros and cons of in-house versus consultants coming in.
Sure. I was implementing a big new health managed care system at a company, and I was fairly new to the organization myself, so I didn't even know necessarily the talents of everybody who reported to me. And there was already an in-house consulting company who was in there working. So what I spent time doing was restructuring the in-house the in-house team that were employees and marrying them up with the consultants who are the external folks. And this was a project structure, org structure, so that the outside consultants would be teaching the in-house project people the skills and how to do project management, et cetera. So I aligned everybody's goals that way to make that happen. The pros of that was the folks that I was paying the big bucks to, the external consultants, knew what the timelines were. They were trained and rewarded on getting projects done on time. They knew the politics, that they knew how to manage projects. The caveat that I put on them as one of their deliverables were, make sure that when you walk out the door, my team can do the exact same thing on their own. If they can't do it without you, you have failed. And as you can imagine, that created a little headbutting for a while. The beauty of it was that the employees of my company saw that as an investment in them. And many of them rose to the top right away, rolled up their sleeves, and they did whatever it took to learn those skills. So the outside consultants came in, they were driving, they were nervous that they weren't going to have future business if they did their job well. So that was one of the cons in their eyes. In my eyes, that was a huge benefit, because eventually we rolled them out and my own team finished up the implementation of the system and did it beautifully. They had some bumps, as Michelle said, they stubbed their toes and they would call and ask for help periodically, but they were little things in the scheme of things. And the icing on the cake is there were at least 3 people out of my team that went on to lead some of the HIPAA implementation work that needed to be done years later, the whole SOX, which is the whole SEC filings and the financial systems upgrades that needed to be done when all those regulations changed. So it was all these in-house people that had been trained by the outside consultants were able to go on and lead these initiatives totally on their own, which is a really big deal. When you talk about budget, it ended up saving the company lots of money in that respect. But what it really did is it increased the whole quality of deliverables, time to deliver, because we had people who knew the company and who knew the inner workings, yet were also smart enough to know when they needed to bring in an outside consultant. So I hope that example helps, Michelle.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. So we've gone through the process. Again, this is extremely, high level. The key takeaways that you want to have here are just understanding what the beginning is, right? What's the first step in your 1,000-mile journey to building the right project team? And it's making sure your team understands the difference between a project structure and a methodology and what the options are. Making sure you interview your team and making sure you're interviewing the right people, not just the executives for what they want, but the people who are down there doing the project work already, and making sure you understand what's working for them and what isn't working for them, what their challenges are and what they'd like to see improved and what they find to be successful, because you can incorporate those things into your team and into your future project structure and methodology. And that's really important. And making sure you define your path forward and communicate it out to everybody. You've talked to the right people, you've gotten approval from the right people, and now you want to make sure you're communicating to the right people so everybody understands what it is. And then finding the right resources to support your project team, whether that's in-house resources or consultants or some combination of both, to help get things up and off the ground. It's a long journey, but you got to start somewhere. So don't be overwhelmed and just take that first step. If you have any questions for Jane or I, please feel free to go ahead and put those in the chat window. We're happy to answer any questions you might have at this time. If you don't feel comfortable asking your question in this public setting, feel free to schedule some time with us one-on-one, and we're happy to answer any questions that you might have just to make sure you're pointed in the right direction.
Michelle, we have one question. The question is, so what about Scrum or Kanban? I've heard of both. Where do those fit in?
Yeah, so Scrum and Kanban are part of the Agile project management process. It's how you manage the tasks associated with those processes or with that methodology, and how you go about prioritizing, assigning those tasks, and then tracking them on a day-to-day basis. So it's just part of the Agile methodology that you use on a daily basis when you're using Agile.
Thank you.
All right. If there are no more questions today, this just recaps the series that we've had. Again, we know we've shared a ton of information today. Please, please don't be overwhelmed. We're going to email you in just a little bit with some very valuable resources. We will include this slide deck as well as the audio recording. Feel free to share that information. We'll also be sending you a link to calendars for both Jane and I. If you'd like to schedule 15 minutes to have a quick chat with us, you can do that. We love sharing our experiences with other people and helping other organizations grow. So if there are no more questions, thank you so much for your time today, and we look forward to having you join us on our next webinar series. Information will be coming out about that shortly.